it's hard to collect against some countries. Try collecting information about North Korea. It's hard to get in there. There are a lot of closed societies. And many of countries around the world are quite good at using deception, trying to fool us. When our satellites come over, they'll cover up what they're doing. They've become very adroit at timing the arrival of American surveillance satellites. And then when it comes to processing, as I suggested, it's a tremendous sifting difficulty, data mining problem. But even given all those problems, I would say the next phase is harder still, and that's called analysis. And by the word analysis, I mean trying to bring insight to the basic data that you've gathered. You can't put on the president's desk some photographs that have been taken by cameras on satellites. For one thing, those photographs are rather difficult to interpret. If you and I looked at one, that looked like a lot of black and white squiggly lines. So someone has to tell you if that's a missile base or exactly what it is, a nuclear reactor, and so on. So what's really important is to take all this information and bring meaning to it. What does it all mean? That's what the president wants to know. He doesn't want to be bombarded with empirical data. He wants to know the implications for the safety of the United States. And so we try to get the smartest people we can, including a number of people from this distinguished institution, to come back to Washington and work with these agencies and try and make sense of what all this information means that's flowing into Washington, D.C., from satellites and drones and wiretaps and human agents and all the rest. Then we're in a position to write a report for the president and other officials. And there are two major reports that I think you ought to be aware of. The first one is known in Washington as the PDB, the President's Daily Brief. It arrives, as the name implies, every day on the President's desk early in the morning. And it gives him a taste of what's happened in the last 24 hours on this globe of ours and what's likely to happen over the next 24 hours. This is known as current intelligence. What's happening now? I suppose one could call it CNN intelligence. And indeed, these intelligence agencies, in a way, are in competition with CNN, who's also reporting back on a daily basis. The other document of importance is the NIE, the National Intelligence Estimate. And here the purpose is to give a longer range understanding of what's happening in the world. In-depth research intelligence. So that if you really want to come to grips with a topic, you don't just have a superficial understanding of what happened in the last 24 hours, but you've got kind of an encyclopedic handling of that particular topic, be it the qualities of Chinese rocket fuel or what the likely leadership succession in China might be, a whole range of different NIEs or national intelligence estimates. Those are our key analytic documents in which we try to interpret the world for our leaders, but there are many others as well. One popular item are baseball-sized cards that have profiles of leaders around the world, so that if you're going to a conference as a U.S. diplomat, you'll know who's sitting around the table with you on the other side from other countries. And you can refer to these baseball cards as you're flying over on the plane or while you're there. Any information that's going to help you become a better representative of the United States. And there are email intelligence today, of course, and most intelligence doesn't even take a paper form because most political leaders want to hear things orally. These tend to be oral people. That's where they got to their high positions because they're good listeners and good talkers. And so they want briefings. And you may give a 150-page NIE to a leading official, and he may never read it. One of my friends likes to point out that some policymakers won't read, some policymakers don't read, and some policymakers can't read. I don't know about that, but I do know they tend to like information orally, sitting in the backseat of the limousine, driving to the airport or wherever, where you're presenting the essential contents of the PDB that day or the NIE that you just completed. Now, all those phases, believe me, are replete with possibilities for failure. But the next phase, and the last one, in some ways, may be the hardest of all. And I'll call that dissemination. This is when you actually present the information to the people who need it, from the president and his cabinet members to other leading national security officials. And the dilemma takes this form. First of all, these are very busy people. Joseph Nye, who teaches international affairs at Harvard and has been in the intelligence community, told me not long ago that when he was Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Affairs, he calculated he had about 10 minutes a day to read intelligence reports. And here's a guy who's a Rhodes Scholar and someone who takes this subject very seriously. The average official probably has less time than that. So somehow you've got to take all this information that you've just spent $50 billion on and get it into the mind of the person who's got to make the decision, the distracted mind of the person who's got to make the decision. And there's an even greater danger here, and it's known as politicization. And by this I mean twisting the information that you may give as a professional intelligence officer to suit the policymakers' political objectives. This is the cardinal sin of intelligence. And one would hope it would never happen, but occasionally it does. Politicization, the spinning of intelligence, often by the politician and somewhat less often, I think, by the intelligence officer, at least in my opinion. I think the intelligence officers are imbued, for the most part, by a professional sense of ethics that prevents them from trying to distort the information. I think 99.9% of the intelligence officers try to speak truth to power rather than cooking or adulterating in some way the information to curry the favor of someone in the White House or elsewhere, although occasionally it does happen, unfortunately. But I think more common is the fact that politicians will be looking for information to support their political views. Now, our best politicians, I think, will avoid that. Our best politicians are going to be people who want to hear the truth and to make decisions based on the reality of the truth, not to distort information, to fool Congress or fool the American people or whatever their motivation might be, or maybe simply to fool themselves because, after all, most of us like to hear good news, not bad news, and most of us like corroboration, not criticism. So selectively perceiving information is a common human malady, but it's something that we would hope our leaders would avoid, and we would certainly hope that they wouldn't take intelligence and twist it in some way. But again, it does happen. So those are the major phases. Now I want to put a couple of case studies through those phases very quickly to give you a sense of how sometimes things don't work out the way the theory would suggest. And I'm going to be fairly brief about this because, after all, we only have 50 minutes. But my first case study will be the 9/11 mistake, probably the most tragic intelligence era in the history of the United States. What went wrong? Well, if you go back and look at that record, and of course the primary source is the Kane Commission report of 2004, you'll find that there were a number of clues around that maybe we were going to be hit by al-Qaeda. I can remember working in the White House in 1995 when across my desk came a top-secret document, which has been declassified, that's why I can talk about it, that said terrorists are going to use a new strategy to bring their violence to the United States. And that new strategy we're going to label, so the CIA document read, aerial terrorism. Well, that caught my attention because we all fly on airplanes. And as I read further, the document went on to say, terrorists, we predict, are going to hijack American commercial airlines. They're going to land them somewhere. They're going to fill them with explosives. They're going to take off again, and then they're going to fly those airplanes into American skyscrapers. 1995. Well, that memo just didn't go to me. It went to a number of people. Certainly the president, the vice president, and the two congressional committees that deal with intelligence. What happened? Nothing happened. Did we tighten airport security? No. Did we inform the American Airline Pilots Association about this possibility? No. Did we contact Norman Mineta, the Secretary of Transportation? No. Did we seal cockpit doors? No. Did we put sky marshals on airplanes? No. Well, of course, I'm speaking with the always good vision of hindsight. But I must tell you, back in 1995, I simply assumed, never assume anything, I guess, I simply assumed that Bill Clinton and others in high office would be taking steps like that. And they didn't. And it's an interesting phenomenon and difficult to explain. But I would point out that in that same top-secret memo from the CIA, there were a number of other potential calamities that were discussed, such as polluting America's water supplies across the country. And I think maybe what happened is there was a kind of numbing effect. There were so many dangers listed in that document that maybe people like Bill Clinton and others with authority felt a little paralyzed about what to do. Furthermore, to avoid all of those calamities, it was going to cost money. Money. And who's going to pay for the sealing of the cockpit doors? Who's going to pay for the sky marshals and so on? It reminds me a little bit of Katrina. After all, engineers warned us long before Katrina that a level 5 hurricane would demolish the levees in New Orleans and there'd be massive flooding. But to bring up the levees to a standard that would prevent that would have cost a lot of money, and nothing was done. Then there were a couple of very prescient FBI agents, one in Minneapolis and one in Arizona, Phoenix, who pointed out to their FBI superiors in Washington that there were some people from the Middle East who were in flight training and their behavior seemed rather erratic, including one fellow in Minnesota who told the flight instructor he didn't care about landing the plane or taking it off. He just wanted to know how to fly it in midair. All this was reported back through top-secret channels to FBI headquarters, and a request was made for a Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court special warrant to go into the apartments of these people engaged in flight training to see if anything incriminating was there. Maybe these were terrorists. Maybe they were in the employment of a hostile intelligence service, maybe even Al-Qaeda. And here's where another major mistake took place, because FBI headquarters never went to that special court. They told the agents back in Arizona and Minnesota that they didn't have enough evidence. I think that's a tragic error, because clearly there was enough evidence there to get a warrant from that particular court. And then we know that a couple of the 19 terrorists had met in Asia, and after a meeting, which we realized was an Al-Qaeda meeting, they then, two of them, journeyed to America with a visa, proper visa, set up residence in San Diego. The CIA knew all of this. But did they clearly tell the FBI that two suspected terrorists had entered San Diego? No, they didn't. Did they check the State Department watch list to see if these two individuals' names were listed as terrorists? No, they didn't. And had they checked that list, they would have found that they were known members of Al-Qaeda. Now, finally, someone several months later decided to let the FBI know this, but then the FBI didn't do anything about it. They finally sent a couple of people out to San Diego to see if they could check up on these two people, and the FBI claims they could never find them, even though we know they were listed in the San Diego telephone book. Good job, FBI, on that one. Even though they had registered with the Motor Vehicle Department to get a license in California. So there were a number of opportunities here that were missed, intelligence gathering opportunities. My second case would be the next major intelligence error we've had in your lifetime, and that is the prediction that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Now, why in the world did we think that when clearly there ended up not being? Well, first of all, we engaged in extrapolation. We had been in Iraq in 1991, 92, 93, first with soldiers and secondly as part of the UN weapons inspection team. And then we were thrown out. But one thing we did discover while we were there was that the Iraqi WMD program was 5 years ahead of where we thought it was. And so after being thrown out, when the president in the late 90s and early 2000s asked the intelligence community, well, what's going on there? This time, the CIA overestimated. We underestimated by 5 years earlier, so let's be on the safe side this time, and let's predict that they probably do have weapons of mass destruction. And then there were other errors that were made. Take, for example, the erroneous HUMET sources that came our way. Oh, thank you. One example would be Curveball, appropriately named, as you'll see. Curveball was a German intelligence asset loaned to us. Not physically, but the information that he was giving to the Germans was given to us. And this person, Curveball, said that when he was in Iraq, he saw clear evidence of chemical biological weapons production. And he swore up and down this was true. The Germans believed him. We believe the Germans because we've had a good relationship with them since the mid-1940s, or late 1940s, I should say, after the war. We asked to see Curveball, and the Germans said no, we don't share our assets to other intelligence services, even friendly ones. Take our word for it. Well, only later, this was 2002, only in 2003, after we had invaded Iraq, did it become clear that Curveball was a psychopath. He was a convicted sexual offender, for one thing, and he was a pathological liar. And he was just trying to make money off German intelligence. And we became a victim of that scheme when the Germans passed the information along to us. Then we captured someone on the Afghan battlefield after 2001, a fellow by the name of Al-Libi. And we flew him to the States. He didn't have much to say, so we decided to send him to Cairo, where they have more convincing methods, shall I say, to try and extract information from people. And under duress, he told the people in Cairo, yes, there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and that was passed on to us by Egyptian intelligence. Then there were rumors that Saddam Hussein had been buying yellow cake uranium for developing a nuclear weapon from Niger in Africa. The CIA sent a former U.S. ambassador to Niger there to check up on things, and he came back and reported that he didn't think that was conceivably true in any way. By the way, this ran contrary to what the White House believed, particularly Dick Cheney, and Dick Cheney and his staff then set about to discredit this ambassador and his wife, who happened to be working inside the CIA, and they revealed her identity. She was an undercover intelligence officer and destroyed her career in the process. Dick Cheney's aide, as you may recall, Mr. Libby, is now in jail because he perjured himself in trying to cover up that attack on the ambassador's wife. So there were a lot of errors that were made, and you can see that this intelligence cycle I've talked to you about doesn't always work the way it should. But here's the biggest error. It is true, contrary to a lot of books that are being published, including some that are bestsellers, it is true that a majority of the intelligence agencies, 13 out of 16, genuinely believed there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And their leader, the director of Central Intelligence, George Tenet, so told the president what this majority opinion was. So I personally believe, and I think there's a lot of evidence to support this, that George Bush didn't spin information, didn't fabricate the record of WMDs in Iraq as an excuse to go in there. That was the evidence that was laid before him by the intelligence agencies, at least 13 out of the 16. Now, I suspect that the Bush administration wanted to go to war against Iraq anyway for a lot of complicated reasons. But I think it's wrong to say that they pushed aside objective intelligence that suggested there were no WMDs there. But here's where the big error occurred, I think. 3 of the agencies were dissenters. The Department of Energy, which is well known for tracking fissionable and fusionable materials around the world and is really expert on nuclear weapons programs, didn't buy into the WMD hypothesis. Nor did one of the most prestigious of all these 16 agencies, INR, Intelligence and Research in the State Department. And one of the disputes had to do with cylinders, aluminum cylinders. And these 3 agencies said those cylinders are for firing conventional rockets, not for building a nuclear centrifuge to develop a nuclear weapon. And then the U.S. Air Force had some severe reservations about the WMD hypothesis, too. Now, if I were DCI, and maybe if you were, you would go to the president and say, we, the intelligence community, think there are WMDs in Iraq. But, Mr. President, it is my obligation as the Director of Central Intelligence to let you know there are 3 major dissenters here, and here are the reasons why they are dissenting. You ought to be aware of that as well. And I think, I can't prove this, but I think George Bush II at that point would have said, or at least should have said, well, let's find out more about this. Because the views of INR and Energy and the U.S. Air Force are not inconsequential. And I want to hear from them directly. And instead of invading next month, why don't we take a couple of more months and test this hypothesis further? But instead, George Tenet went into the Oval Office and left the president with the impression that there was virtually no dissent. You remember the famous comment that Bob Woodward mentioned when the president asked George Tenet, was he sure about the WMDs? The response was, it's a slam dunk, Mr. President. And at that point, George Tenet, a friend of mine and in many ways a decent guy, at that point, George Tenet, the Director of Central Intelligence, violated his oath of office, I think, to make sure the president knew the full array of information about world events. That's where George Tenet should have really weighed in making sure the president understood that this was not a completely unanimous point of view. And the same thing happened, by the way, with respect to an NIE related to Iraq on the eve of our invasion there. A 2002 NIE did mention at the rear of the document, some 40 pages long, the 3 dissenters, Air Force, INR, and Energy. But, you know, busy members of Congress often don't get to page 61. They read the executive summary up front, or maybe the first few pages. And that's where those dissents should have been highlighted, and they never were. Again, a problem of inadequate dissemination. So those are my 2 case studies. Now I'm going to race through, in just a few minutes, some of the challenges that Obama has, I think, in correcting some of these weaknesses. And then let's open things up. First of all, let me go back to planning and direction. We don't have a good grand strategy for American foreign policy. What are the objectives of the United States in the world today? And until we formulate exactly what we hope to achieve in this world, it's pretty hard to come up with a convincing list of intelligence priorities. Now, I suppose you and I would argue that one of the main objectives would be to spread democracy as much as possible. But exactly how are we going to do that? And what other objectives do we have? So Obama's got to have people working on a grand strategy for this era we're in now. Skipping next to collection, we have gone overboard with technical collection. Those satellites up there that cost us billions of dollars can't tell us what's going on in the caves where bin Laden is conspiring against us. For that, you need a human asset inside the al-Qaeda structure. And to succeed in doing that, you've got to have people like you, potential case officers, who know those local languages and the history and the culture, and can then go to those countries and recruit local people effectively to enter al-Qaeda and be listeners on our behalf. This is a challenge for the whole country to improve our human intelligence, because technical intelligence just doesn't do the job well enough. And then when it comes to processing, maybe Bill Gates or some other genius out in Silicon Valley or right here in Provo ought to be designing our computers back in Washington, D.C. to sift through this information more effectively. Because right now we're losing the battle of the fire hose and trying to sort out the signals from the noise. And then when it comes to analysis, we need more competitive analysis. We need to make sure that we bring in BYU professors to look at these documents that are being written by intelligence officers, because there's a lot of brain power right here and in other universities across the country. And right now the intelligence community is way too insulated and needs to reach out and have red team, blue team exercises where you have other people critique the work that goes to the White House, and then registers what the dissents are very clearly. And then when it comes to dissemination, above all, reminding people time and time again not to distort intelligence, either as an intelligence officer or as a political figure receiving them. And what should an intelligence officer do when a politician distorts the information and lies to the American people, twists the information to fool us to enter a war or to do some other foreign policy activity that may harm us? There's got to be a resignation, a public resignation by an intelligence officer in a condition like that, rather than George Tenet covering up the dissent and never really criticizing how the intelligence was being used. Let me just say this finally. I mentioned a couple of other missions. One was Covert Action. We have a new airplane called the Predator, which flies around with cameras on it collecting information. That's great. But now we're equipping it with Hellfire missiles that can fire rockets at people and kill them. And a couple of years ago in Yemen, we had a Predator run by someone in Las Vegas. That's scary in itself. Who peered down at an automobile. It had 6 people in it. Our estimation was they were al-Qaeda members. We fired the missiles. We incinerated the automobile, killed the people inside. Only later did we discover that one of those 6 was an American citizen. Now, maybe he was a bad person. But did he ever have due process? Was there ever a trial? What was the evidence against him? So this idea of sending predators around the world, engaging in paramilitary operations, firing Hellfire missiles in different countries, is quite alarming from my point of view. And then counterintelligence. We've got to make sure that we protect our information better than we are. We've had 2 major spies inside our government, Aldrich Ames and Robert Hansen, and we've got to pay more attention to that subject. My final word has to do with accountability. These secret agencies can sometimes be used against us, and so we have to make sure that we have our lawmakers taking a close look at how predators are being used and how wiretaps are being used inside this country, because we don't want them used against innocent Americans. So you can see President Obama and his assistants have a very large challenge before them, and not least will be to make these 16 agencies work more harmoniously together, which means probably giving more authority to the Director of National Intelligence, a new office. Right now that person doesn't have budget or appointment powers, and I think that has made the office unnecessarily weak. You've been a wonderful audience, and I thank you for your attention.